What happens when the world refuses to schedule its emergencies? What happens when two flashpoints ignite at the same time? Not sequentially, not conveniently, but simultaneously. Kuan once warned that the true test of a great power is not whether it can win one conflict. It is whether it can maintain balance when pressure comes from multiple directions at once. He believed the most dangerous moment for a dominant state is not when it faces a single rival, but when it must divide attention under compression. And if you look at today's global maritime map, you begin to understand why that warning matters more than ever. Picture this. An American carrier strike group is operating deep in the Indo-Pacific. Fighter jets cycle through patrols. Destroyers screen against submarine threats. Satellites feed live targeting data. Everything is focused on deterrence in one region. Then, without warning, a second crisis erupts thousands of miles away. Another maritime corridor becomes unstable, a different rival escalates, shipping routes are threatened, allies request immediate reassurance, two crises, one fleet. Think about what that means. For decades after the Cold War, the United States operated in an environment where crises were usually regional and sequential. The Navy could surge forces from one theater to another without facing peer-level naval resistance in multiple regions simultaneously. But today, simultaneity is the defining risk. The Indo-Pacific is contested. European maritime security is active. Strategic choke points elsewhere require protection. Emerging Arctic routes introduce new variables. If two crises erupt at once, arithmetic becomes destiny. An aircraft carrier's visible deployment may last 7 months, but that deployment ties up the ship for more than a year when training and maintenance cycles are included. Submarines rotate through long operational patterns. Destroyers require upkeep. Shipyards operate near structural limits. If one carrier is already committed in the Indo-Pacific, repositioning it leaves a vacuum there. If another carrier is undergoing maintenance, it cannot surge instantly. If destroyers are escorting shipping in one theater, they cannot simultaneously reinforce another. This is not weakness, it is math. Kuan believed that rising powers study precisely this kind of math. They do not need to defeat a dominant navy outright. They need to create simultaneity. They need to stretch response cycles. They need to force allocation decisions. When two crises occur at once, prioritization becomes unavoidable. Which theater receives reinforcement? Which accepts calculated risk? Which allies receive visible reassurance? Which deployments are extended beyond ideal cycles? Every decision carries cost. Now consider readiness margins, maintenance windows shrink under surge deployment, training cycles compress, personnel tempo increases, industrial repair schedules tighten, munitions stockpiles draw down faster than planned. If the fleet was operating at high tempo before the crises, its surge elasticity narrows. Kuan warned that the danger of overstretch is not immediate collapse, but thinner buffers. And when buffers thin, miscalculation risk rises. Two crises create compression. Compression forces speed. Speed reduces deliberation. Reduced deliberation increases escalation risk. Now consider deterrence psychology. If adversaries perceive that one theater absorbs the majority of attention, they may test the other. If deployment patterns become reactive rather than deliberate, signals change. Rivals study rotation cycles. They analyze maintenance schedules. They observe shipyard throughput. They do not need superiority. They need timing. Lee understood that strategic competition often revolves around exploiting moments when attention divides. Two crises test alliance cohesion as well. Allies expect reassurance. They measure credibility and presence. If reinforcement is delayed because assets are committed elsewhere, perceptions shift. Political confidence fluctuates. Strategic depth narrows. The United States Navy remains extraordinarily capable. Its submarines are advanced. Its carriers are powerful instruments of projection. Its alliances provide unmatched reach, but no navy is infinite. Industrial capacity cannot expand overnight. Personnel endurance has limits. Geography imposes distance. Two crises force exposure of those limits. Now add technological compression. Modern surveillance reduces concealment. Long-range precision weapons extend engagement envelopes. Hypersonic development shortens decision windows. Cyber vulnerabilities intersect with physical platforms. In a dual crisis scenario, reaction timelines shrink even further. Decision makers must balance escalation risk in two regions simultaneously. If munition stockpiles draw down quickly in one theater, replenishment becomes urgent. If maintenance cycles are deferred, long-term readiness erodes. If industrial repair throughput is stressed, recovery slows. Kuan believed that endurance defines dominance, not initial strength, not symbolic presence, but the ability to sustain pressure without structural fracture. Two crises test endurance directly. The readiness trap tightens under dual stress. Presence in one region competes with presence in another. Modernization programs pause. Personnel fatigue increases. Logistics chains stretch across vast distances. The blind spot becomes visible. Omnipresence was never permanent. Simultaneity reveals that. Lee would argue that the solution is not panic, nor retreat. It is prioritization, strategic concentration, alliance burden sharing. Industrial expansion before crisis demands surge production. Clear-eyed assessment of which theaters matter most in long-term competition. The era of sequential crisis management has ended. The era of simultaneous pressure has begun. The U.S. Navy remains formidable. But two crises expose structural arithmetic. Not defeat, not weakness, but allocation. And allocation is strategy. If one crisis requires decisive concentration, the other may require allied leadership. If industrial capacity is to sustain prolonged operations, peacetime investment must precede wartime demand. If personnel tempo is to remain sustainable, deployment cycles must be disciplined before dual stress emerges. Lee Kuan Yew predicted that the 21st century would not be defined by single-front confrontation. It would be defined by layered competition: economic, technological, maritime, political. Two crises at once are not hypothetical. They are structural possibility, and what happens when they occur depends not on raw power alone. It depends on margin, on preparation, on industrial resilience, on alliance cohesion, on disciplined prioritization. The oceans remain vast, the fleet remains powerful, but in a world of compressed timelines and overlapping flashpoints, simultaneity is the ultimate stress test. Lee Kuan Yew saw that coming, not as prophecy, but as logic. When great powers face two crises at once, they do not lose immediately. They reveal their margins. And in dangerous eras, margin determines everything. And here's where the scenario becomes even more complex. Because two crises don't just divide ships. They divide attention, they divide political bandwidth, they divide strategic clarity. Imagine a situation where one crisis escalates quickly: missile launches, maritime blockades, intense signaling, media coverage saturates global headlines, markets react instantly, political leaders face pressure to act decisively. At the same time, a second crisis unfolds more quietly, but no less strategically significant. Naval maneuvers intensify in another region. An ally requests reinforcement. Intelligence reports indicate rising risk. Which crisis dominates decision-making? Which one absorbs the most assets? Which one becomes the priority? Lee Kuan Yew understood that great powers are most vulnerable when their attention fragments. Strategic focus becomes blurred. Allocation becomes reactive rather than deliberate. Two crises create competition not just for ships, but for clarity. Now think about escalation ladders. If a naval confrontation in one region requires rapid reinforcement, moving assets from another theater may signal vulnerability there. That signal can be interpreted as opportunity. Adversaries do not need to coordinate formally to exploit this. They only need to observe. In a multipolar maritime environment, pressure in one region can create openings in another, not necessarily through alliance, but through simultaneity. That's the structural reality Lee Kuan Yew anticipated. He believed rising powers would not necessarily challenge directly. They would challenge structurally, by increasing complexity, by forcing allocation choices, by exploiting stretched margins. Two crises amplify complexity. Now consider munitions and logistics. Modern naval warfare depends on precision munitions, missile defense interceptors, spare parts, fuel, satellite bandwidth, cyber resilience. If high-intensity operations begin in one region, munition stockpiles draw down rapidly. Replenishment requires industrial throughput and secure logistics lines. If a second crisis requires readiness simultaneously, stockpile allocation becomes a calculation. Which theater receives priority resupply? Which accepts delay? Industrial capacity cannot be expanded in real time. It must be prepared years in advance. Lee Kuan Yew repeatedly emphasized that endurance depends on preparation before crisis, not improvisation during it. Two crises expose whether preparation was sufficient. Then there is alliance cohesion. Allies in one region expect reassurance. Allies in another region expect the same. If assets are redistributed visibly, political narratives shift. Confidence is sensitive to presence. In a dual crisis environment, alliance management becomes as critical as fleet management. Lee understood that alliances multiply strength, but they also require credibility. Credibility depends on sustainable presence. Now imagine personnel tempo under dual stress. Extended deployments lengthen further. Maintenance crews work compressed schedules. Sailors rotate more frequently. Fatigue increases. Morale faces pressure. Personnel are not infinite multipliers. They are human, and human endurance has limits. Two crises stretch not only hardware, but people. The strategic blind spot becomes clearer in this context. If the Navy's planning models assume sequential crisis management, dual pressure forces recalibration under stress. If industrial depth is optimized for peacetime cycles rather than wartime surge, simultaneity reveals constraint. If modernization programs rely on steady funding rather than rapid adaptation, dual crises slow transformation. Lee Kuan Yew would argue that this is not defeat. It is revelation. Two crises do not break a great power. They reveal whether its structure matches its ambition. Now consider deterrence in such an environment. If one region receives decisive concentration of force, deterrence there strengthens, but deterrence elsewhere may weaken if presence visibly thins. That does not mean collapse. It means calculation shifts. Rivals watch closely, they test margins, they measure response times. In a dual crisis scenario, speed matters, but speed without margin increases escalation risk. Decisions made under compression carry higher stakes. Lee believed that the greatest danger is miscalculation born from structural strain. If two crises force rush decisions, escalation ladders shorten. If communication channels are overloaded, misunderstanding grows. If military posture becomes reactive, predictability declines. Predictability is stabilizing. Unpredictability under strain is destabilizing. The U.S. Navy still retains enormous structural advantages: global logistics networks, forward basing agreements, undersea superiority in many domains, alliance depth, technological integration, but advantages must be preserved through disciplined pacing. Simultaneity tests pacing. Two crises demand elasticity. Elasticity depends on margin. Margin depends on preparation. Preparation depends on strategic clarity years before crisis emerges. Lee Kuan Yew did not predict specific wars. He predicted structural patterns. He understood that the 21st century would not offer neat, isolated conflicts. It would present overlapping pressures, economic competition intertwined with military signaling, technological rivalry overlapping with maritime maneuvering, political crises unfolding alongside security challenges. Two crises at once are not rare anomalies. They are structural possibilities. And what happens when they occur is not determined by rhetoric. It is determined by readiness margin, industrial depth, alliance cohesion, and disciplined prioritization. The fleet remains powerful. But power divided without preparation becomes strain. Strain under compression becomes risk. Lee Kuan Yew's prediction was not alarmist. It was logical. When great powers face two crises simultaneously, they do not fall instantly. They reveal whether their strategic architecture was built for simultaneity or for a world that no longer exists. And in a century defined by overlapping flashpoints, simultaneity is no longer hypothetical. It is inevitable. The question is not whether the U.S. Navy can win one conflict. The question is whether it can sustain two pressures without losing margin. Because in dangerous eras, margin is the difference between deterrence and escalation. And that is what happens when the world refuses to wait its turn. When great powers face two crises at once, they do not lose immediately. They reveal their margins. And in dangerous eras, margin determines everything.